USAA knows dynamic duos can save the day, like superheroes and sidekicks or auto and home insurance. With USAA, you can bundle your auto and home and save up to 10%. Tap the banner to learn more and get a quote at usaa.com/bundle. Restrictions apply.
Hey, it's Sterling K. Brown from the Hulu original series Paradise. The next chapter begins as Xavier's search for his wife takes him above ground, and what he finds will change everything. It was never just about the bunker. Tune in and discover the truth lies outside. Paradise, the official podcast, is now streaming, and stream Paradise on Hulu and Hulu on Disney+.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love.
Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm political scientist Michael Baranowski, an emeritus professor at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by Oklahoma Christian University political scientist Trey Orndorff. Hey, Trey.
Mike, it's great to be here with you.
Yeah, it's a Friday afternoon. I'm used to kind of the Saturday morning thing. I'm not sure if that means I'm going to be worn out by the week or maybe better because sometimes in the mornings I need a little while to get going. Guess we'll find out here shortly. But before we do, I want to just briefly take a minute to suggest people check out another podcast, not aside from this one, in addition to the Politics Guys, actually from a longtime listener supporter of the show, Eric McGuire's got a new show called Civics Over Politics.
Ooh.
I'm a listener and a subscriber. Eric kept me company while I was shoveling snow a couple of days ago. Now it's 60 outside, so go figure, Cincinnati in February. Anyway, but I thought it was a great way to spend my time when I was doing that, and so I hope you'll check it out, and I will make sure to put a link in the show notes to that.
Wonderful. Say that name one more time, Mike.
What's that? It's Civics Over Politics.
Civics Over Politics. Okay, I'm curious about that.
All right. So, Trey, do you want to start us off with the State of the Union?
Absolutely. I mean, look, I'm a presidential scholar. I should start us off. So let's do our takeaways, our fact checkings, our low light highlights. I don't know what we want to call that. But let's see. I'm going to be honest with everybody. If you're listening right now, I did not watch all of this. I read it. That's what I do. And part of that was this was the longest State of the Union in American history, right? It clocked in at 1 hour and 47 minutes. And according to the American Presidency Project, that means now that Trump and Clinton claimed 9 of the top 10 longest State of the Union speeches in history. So look, I get it. I'm going to guess most of you guys have not listened to all of it itself. Instead, you're going to have read it or seen pieces of it. And there's a lot that was going on. And there was a lot that didn't happen, right? We didn't get more clarity on Iran. We didn't get a more direct attack on the Supreme Court from those sitting there. Instead, Trump really seemed to decide to go after Democrats in the room, especially as it related to immigration and gender transition. I think the biggest moments were defined by Trump calling out Democrats, in some cases going off script to mock them directly, such as when he called people lazy and that none of them would stood up and more directly clap for him. And then we obviously get the Tlaib moment where she shouted that you're the most corrupt president, end quote. To which President Trump's going to respond, you should be ashamed of yourselves. So, Mike, from me, I think the big thing that kind of stood out was when you looked at it in the aftermath, a lot of what people were looking at was the response from Democrats rather than the content of the speech itself. NPR did a whole piece on this right after the State of the Union. It almost said nothing about the State of the Union itself. It was all about Tlaib and Omar. So what was your takeaway on that front? Did you think that the distractions from Democrats was the biggest story here, or was it the things that weren't said?
Well, I think we all can admit that if there were even any pretense ever that the State of the Union was anything substantive, that's gone at this point. Number one, I think it's fair to say that fact-checking simply does not matter anymore. Or truth doesn't, because when President Trump can claim that in the past 9 months, 0 illegal aliens have been admitted to the United States, and that, oh, by the way, prescription drug prices have been down by 300, 400, 500, 600%. So apparently a bunch of Americans are getting paid by the drug companies to take drugs, which, sign me up, I suppose. But
I got an infusion coming up. Let's do it.
There you go. You could use a couple $1,000s for that infusion. But my larger point here is, this goes back to Steve Bannon's famous thing about you flood the zone with shit, that strategy, and those are his words, not mine, which essentially desensitizes people to lies. And we're at the point now where Donald Trump is judged by the sort of such a lenient standard when it comes to truth, and he created that lenient standard by just lying like hell all the time. And it's a strategy that seems to have worked essentially, but I feel like at this point, fact-checking a State of the Union address is a pointless exercise, essentially.
Well, I mean, that was one of the things I've been thinking about as I was reading it, as I was looking through it. Do State of the Union speeches even matter, right? I mean, today, presidents can speak directly to the American public more than they ever had in the past, unfiltered. I mean, look, 30 seconds before the State of the Union address, we've got President Trump, who's directly connecting with people via Truth Social, which is linked to his X account, which is linked to all of these accounts that individuals are following on social media. You take a look at the actual numbers. He gets 27.8 million views. That's a 24% decrease from the 2025 address. It's sitting just above the lowest of all time, which is Joe Biden's in 2023 at 27.3 million. I know those numbers sound big. They're not that big. So, I mean, whether you fact check it or not, what kind of does the State of the Union address even matter in contemporary politics?
I think it matters in the same way that, in a sense, the same way that Saturday Night Live and a lot of late night shows matter. It's not like people watch them. They're designed to create clips. Like that moment you mentioned where Trump said, stand if you believe the first duty of the American government is to support American citizens over illegal aliens or something to that effect. And of course, this was designed to create these clips, and already the RNC and, Republican media strategists are trying to figure out the best way to work in the campaigns. That's what this is all about. I mean, it's about, and the Tlaib yelling stuff, it's a great thing to fundraise off of, from both sides, probably, actually. So, yeah, it's always been somewhat political theater. But, one other thing I guess I'll mention is that clearly Donald Trump loves the sound of his own voice. He does have the longest State of the Union. Now, to get pedantic, right, his speech last year is number 2, technically not a State of the Union, technically an address before a joint session of Congress, because when a president is in their first term, just after being elected, that's only a couple months after. So technically, that's not a State of the Union. Tell that to people in press them at parties, and I'm sure you'll just go over big on that. But anyway, but I guess if we pull back and look at the actual State of the Union, maybe that's a better way to kind of consider this, because that was the whole point of why a transmission of the State of the Union is required. It became an address, of course, in the 20th century. But I think you could argue from a MAGA view. You could say, well, you know what? The State of the Union, pretty good. The Dow's up over something like 14% over last year. The S&P's up. The NASDAQ's up over 20%. We removed Maduro and Venezuela. We're finally getting tough with Iran. We've taken in hundreds of billions of tariff revenue, and the border's more secure than it's been in years. Crime is down. Inflation is a fairly reasonable 2-point-something%. The unemployment rate's under 5%. Wage growth is up. So, hey, what's the problem here? I think that's probably, didn't Trump say at one point, we're just winning so much, we just don't even know what to do with all the winning that we're doing. We're crazy from so much winning. And I think, while from your standpoint and my standpoint, that might sound bizarre, I really think that if you try to sort of put yourself in the MAGA viewpoint, that you can kind of point to a lot of things that feel like wins, even if, as political scientists, we would probably say, well, how much of this could you attribute to the administration and its policies, and were these, in fact, drags on the economy? Well, yeah, but as we know, presidents tend to get a lot of credit when things go well, rightly or wrongly, and blame when they go wrong, rightly or wongly. So, I don't know. That's sort of my MAGA State of the Union consideration, I guess.
Yeah, I think maybe to pick up on that a little bit, add a little bit to you were talking about the real purpose of the State of the Union addresses empirically are to make the clips. And I think you're absolutely right. These are designed. It's in some ways the same way that we've talked about this in the show before, that President Trump talks. His own speeches are almost like little Twitter or X vignettes that he's stringing together. And so when you look at it in its totality, it seems strange because it's not really meant to fit together. It's meant to be these little pieces, these little clips that are going to go out, that they're going to come forward. I think on that front, that's an area that Democrats have got to figure that out. I don't think they've come to that realization. And so a minute ago, you had said, I think that helps both sides with the fundraising and things. I don't think they figured out how to look good on those fronts. I'm thinking back to like Nancy Pelosi ripping up the speech. That was a terrible, like that was not the meme look that Nancy Pelosi, I think, really was looking for. And I think here where like Omar and Tlaib thought that they were going to come off as being like having a spine, it just fed into the meme for Donald Trump of Democrats to go. I'd have to think about more what that's going to look like. I don't think Democrats have a counter-programming strategy for the meme-ified State of the Union address.
Maybe not specifically for the State of the Union address. I mean, certainly I think it's telling that they chose a Democratic governor to deliver the response, the Democratic response. And it was a much more sort of grown-up sort of speech, right? It focused on affordability, safety, the honesty of President Trump, all things on which I'd say he's, fairly vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
But I do think, though, that, say, from Tlaib's standpoint, that's her brand. She's just playing into her brand, just like Fetterman plays into his brand with the ridiculous, I probably wears Carhartt hoodies to bed. I don't know, or something, certainly when the camera's on or, so.
Well, I mean, after the fact, Fetterman does make a point of noting he's the only president or the only Democrat president who ends up standing up and clapping for certain things for President Trump.
Yeah. I mean, so basically I feel like, I guess my initial reaction to anything that a politician says or does is to just assume it's BS and there's something else going on. So I'm interested in what actually happens, but what they say and do, it just makes me feel like I need to take a shower on both sides, really, of things anyway. But, I also think, though, getting back to the actual State of the Union, even if you take that sort of MAGA view, there's the inconvenient fact that Trump is at somewhere around 41% approval, which is, by the way, lower than the failed Joe Biden was at the same point in his term, and actually even slightly lower than Trump, but it was at this point in his first term. And so if you're not a MAGA person, you look at slowing job growth, even though it's, still decent. You look at the costs imposed by his tariff regime, the 1.5 million or so people who don't have health insurance anymore due to Trump's lack of willingness to kind of put forward to push those ACA subsidies. The people who are paying a lot more for health insurance. So, federal agents killing Americans, international adventurism. There's plenty to be feeling pretty badly about, and certainly a lot of more Americans are feeling badly about the State of the Union than are feeling positive about it.
Well, I mean, look, if you've taken a look at Drudge Report today, what's the top line story even on Drudge is the fact that the kind of inflation has been ticking back up. And generally speaking, the feelings from people on that come in sooner than the actual inflation data. So, I mean, I hear what you're saying on that front, but I think affordability, which again, you're right, Spanberger is the one who's going to highlight that here. I think that's the Achilles heel of the Trump administration right now. And I think that's why they're concerned about the midterms. I mean, you're always going to be concerned given the structural items, but I think they're especially concerned because of affordability.
Yeah.
That made up.
And I should say, Trump did mention some things that you might call a legislative agenda. For instance, he said he wants Congress to, codify his attempts to lower drug prices, to pass that Stop Insider Trading Act, the DHS funding thing, the Save America Act, that proof of citizenship to vote thing. He also mentioned his great health care plan. Oh, by the way, that's the actual name of it. So I just want to point that out. And by the way, if
it was one big, beautiful bill. Are we really surprised? It's the great health care plan.
Well, the great thing about it is that you can have severe ADHD and still get the whole thing in because it's literally a one-page fact sheet. That is the plan. But to be fair to Trump, given the fact that Republicans only have right now a four-seat majority in the House, 3 seats in the Senate where you need 60 votes for anything except some reconciliation stuff, it's not like he has much of a shot at getting through even a mildly ambitious legislative agenda. So you could argue that maybe it's better not to push this hugely ambitious thing that has no chance whatsoever of being passed. I mean, I think Trump realizes that if he wants to do stuff, he needs to do it through executive action. And that, of course, is what he's doing.
Well, and that's what we just saw, as a matter of fact, this week, right? Just yesterday, the Washington Post has a 17-page draft of what potentially will be effectively the SAVE Act on steroids coming to us via an executive order. And so you're not wrong. And this goes back. I mean, This is a very tight Congress with a very tight presidency. And in those circumstances, presidents are far less likely to use communication. They're likely to pull any direct levers of action they have. And as you rightfully point out, executive actions are one of them.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on the State of the Union, Trey, before we move on?
No, I think we should get to our next thing.
Fox News is now streaming live on Fox One. When news breaks, we don't just report it. We go beyond the headlines to get the full story. Get live coverage, in-depth analysis, and perspectives from the voices you trust, all in one place. Whether you're at home or on the go, stay connected to the stories shaping our world. Stream Fox News on Fox One. Download today.
All right, well, why don't we go ahead and do that? And the next thing actually is tariffs. And I'm sure most listeners know last week the Supreme Court struck down most of President Trump's tariffs. And that ruling, Learning Resources versus Trump, essentially held that the 1977 emergency powers law that Trump used to impose tariffs on, well, nearly every country in the world doesn't grant him that power. And shortly after the ruling, Trump called the 6 justices in the majority disloyal and unpatriotic. And within hours, he signed an executive order imposing a new 15% tariff on all imports under a different law, Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. That allows the president to respond to large and serious balance of payments deficits. Now, it's never been used by a president before. Now, we'll get into why in a bit. And it expires in 150 days without congressional approval. And the trade deals the administration cut with, well, multiple countries, the UK, EU, Japan, South Korea, others, they were built on those IEEPA tariff rates that no longer have legal force. And so the EU has kind of paused ratification of its agreement. I think some trading partners are reassessing their positions. And right now it kind of looks that some countries that maybe cut early deals might end up doing worse than countries that stalled or held out. Now, the administration, I think, seems to be positioning Section 122 as kind of a 5-month-long bridge to give it enough time to impose tariffs under other legislation, mainly Section 301 of the 1974 Trade Act, as well as Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. But both of those require, by law, extensive investigations to justify any tariffs and are less sweeping. So, Trey, I thought you and Justin, you did a good job discussing the court's ruling last week, especially given the fact you had literally hours between the time the ruling came out and you recorded. But I guess the first thing I'm wondering is, now that you've had a week to really dig into the various opinions in the ruling, has your view of that you expressed last week of the court's ruling, has that changed any, or?
No, if anything, it's solidified a little bit in the wake of additional rulings we've seen. And we'll deal with this later, either on this show or on the bonus show, where we take a look at the Supreme Court ruling on the United States Postal Service. I'll be honest, I feel like I've been channeling my inner kin more frequently on that front. And I don't think the court was attempting to be corrupt in that sense. However, it is really tough to get behind Justice Thomas recently in any meaningful way. It is difficult for a man who has long claimed to be an originalist, not a textualist. He seems to be attempting to butcher the English language to the edges of its meaning. I think the thing that I've kind of walked away with after a week that's a bigger deal is, if you take a look at the markets seem to indicate that most people think that Trump is going to kind of still get away with it. And the reason I suggest that, I don't know if you've seen this, Mike, but right now companies can sell the possibility of their refunds from the tariffs being illegal. And hedge funds are buying these up at historic rates because they think there's a possibility to make money. Right now, $1 of tariff refunds can be purchased for 40 cents. So what that suggests to me is that most of these companies think this money is never coming, which that's a larger, and I think more so than just the ruling, I think that's the story right now.
Well, yeah, when I listened to your show last week, like I said, I thought you did a good job, but I felt like, wow, I actually feel like there wasn't nearly enough respect for the dissenting view. And I think they did make some solid arguments.
Okay, well, please, let's talk about that a little bit. Yeah, yeah.
Let me explain. So they claim, more or less, that the majority misconstrues what tariffs are. say, okay, they're taxes, yes, but they're also an instrument of foreign policy, which is an area where the executive historically gets significant discretion. And okay, IEPA doesn't use the word tariff. It does include the broader phrase regulate importation, which under a common sense understanding, you can argue, includes the ability to impose tariffs because that's one way to regulate imports. And finally, on the major questions doctrine, this isn't some magic words rule or something like that. And when we see statutes that involve foreign affairs emergencies, such as this one, flexibility for the executive is critical. That's the whole point of making emergency statutes broad so that the executive does have flexibility to deal with these things. And so those statutes need to be read in that context. So under this reading, if you got a problem with what President Trump did, I sure as hell have a problem with what he did. I think it's a stupid idea. But my real problem in this case is with the Congress that gave presidents this sort of vague emergency power. And they could have specifically excluded tariffs or put stricter limits on how long the regulation of imports could last without congressional approval, like they did in Section 122, 150 days, or even required some sort of formal process to determine whether an actual emergency existed. But they did not do any of those things. And hey, if you're going to be a judicially restrained jurist, you say it's not the job of the courts to bail out Congress if it does sloppy work. That's judicial overreach. And so it would also encourage Congress to keep on writing bad, vague legislation, knowing that the courts are just going to come up behind them and clean things up in the end. So under that reading, I think that, in the end, I don't really end up agreeing entirely with the dissent. I don't think it's at all an unreasonable position to take.
Let me push back a little bit because I'm going to disagree even with your more reasonable version of the dissent. One, there's an underlying assumption that you're making there, which is that vagueness is therefore a deferment to presidential power. And that largely is a view that only exists if we accept a fuller view of the vesting clause in Article 2 as meaning the president basically gets any power as long as the Congress isn't restricting it. And I don't adhere to that view. I don't get that broad view. So I can get on board to the point where you're saying, look, Congress could be better in terms of not allowing their language to be as broad. Where I'm going to disagree, firstly, is right there to suggest, but look, does vagueness mean that the president then has residual power over these kinds of issues? Respond to that to start with.
Yeah, I would say that certainly the president can't say, well, this power hasn't been prohibited to me by Congress, so therefore I have this power. That would be, I would agree with you there.
Okay.
I think in the context of saying regulate importation, that is enough given that this is an emergency statute specifically, that kind of constrains it right there. And so under these specific conditions, I think that this is a reasonable, again, I think on balance, I find myself a bit more swayed, especially by Justice Gorsuch's concurrence, where he just basically said, the hell with all of you, except for me. I'm the only one who's not being kind of crazy in my reasoning about this. I liked his concurrence the best of all. But I don't think that dissent is just like this, oh my God, where are they coming from with this? I see where they're coming from. I think they're good arguments, but I don't think they're quite as good as the arguments of the majority here.
But I'm going to come back to Thomas here on this front, right? Because Thomas is, in fact, doubling down on the theory there that you're suggesting you don't agree with. He is suggesting that it's the unitary executive theory of the president that allows this to happen. And therefore, Congress couldn't restrict that anyway, even if it wanted to, because this, in fact, falls into the presidential duties. And that's there where I'm going to have my biggest complaint, especially with Thomas on that front. He's not making the more nuanced argument that you're there. And if he was, he'd be, I think, a more reasonable, I could get at him. But I feel like you're giving him a read that even he himself is not attempting to put forward.
Well, I think we need to separate out the dissent that was written by the three justices, that was joined by all three of them, and Thomas's separate dissent.
Okay.
Because oftentimes Thomas will have some readings that none of the other justices necessarily agree with. But I'm pretty sure even his dissent, even Justice Thomas's view of the unitary executive power is not such that he would argue that absent any sort of statutory justification a president would point to, he can just say, you know what, it's Tuesday, tariff day. It's not quite that far. Again, I have issues with Justice Thomas, but I don't think that he's as crazily out there as a lot of people do. He is kind of living in his own sort of constitutional world, but it's not an insane world. It's just different.
I'll be honest, last week, he is who I primarily lampooned when it came to what I thought being the minority there. But okay, so that was one item. But the other piece here on the majority opinion that you're kind of coming at is the idea that, if Congress had been more effective. I also think that we have to read anything that Congress writes in light of the powers that they have and can and can't delegate via the Constitution. Right. And it seems pretty clear to me, and I think it seems pretty clear to most scholars, I doubt that you're far from this, that Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 of the Constitution is pretty clear, right? The answer is when we're talking about taxes, duties on imposts and excises, it's all exclusively Congress. There doesn't appear to be a way in which even, let's say, and I'm not going to disagree with you on this, this is not the greatest written piece of legislation ever, but even if you write something poorly, you don't get to undo the Constitution as a result of your poor reading. And that seems to be the exploitive nature of what the President Trump here is arguing from on the positive side. Another reason why I support the majority, because as Roberts reminds us, this sits with Congress. So even if we're going to read Congress as messy as it is, we've got to read it as being consistent with the Constitution. How do we get this explicit Article 1 power to the president?
Well, I think you got to be careful in not reading things into the majority opinion that aren't necessarily there, because I think it would have been a very different decision if the word tariff had been in the IEPA law, specifically in there. And so you're arguing about whether or not certain congressional powers are simply impossible to delegate, even if Congress wants to. The court didn't address that question, and I'm sure if they'd focused on that, one or two justices probably would have jumped on that and been on that side. But I think that if the word tariff had been in the IEPA legislation, that this would have been probably 6-3 in Trump's favor, my guess, to allow him to carry out these tariffs under IEPA. I understand what you're saying. Of course, you and I differ a lot in terms of our view of the unitary executive theory. I don't like it, but I do think it's more constitutionally defensible than you do. And so my reading of this decision in the Constitution kind of comes from that place, whereas yours comes from a very different and, just unfortunately less correct place.
Well, I mean, that's fair. I hear that. And I think you've analyzed that correctly, and that it is our presupposition starting place is about the unitary executive theory. And this is also where I think we would both disagree with Ken. I am going to argue that it is also primarily there that we're seeing the justices split, rather than, if Ken was here, he'd be like, well, y'all know we got those partisan right-wing and he doesn't use that voice. I don't know where that came from, but
Ken actually's been smoking like cigarettes for like 3 hours or something.
He's on the show, and so I'm not taking that position.
Sure.
But I think the distinction we're finding between each other probably also explains a lot of the difference that we're finding here among the justices.
Yeah.
And so to have us talk about that probably helps listeners understand that as well too.
I wanted also to talk about what you thought about the Trump administration's sort of plan to work around this ruling. I mentioned in the intro that it seemed to me like they were just using Section 122 as a bridge, although my take on Section 122, that authority, is that it's actually not something that the president can legally invoke, because the conditions under which it needs to be invoked simply do not exist. But I wanted to get your take on that.
Well, look, that's where I was getting to at the market for function. I think the market has this relatively accurately pictured, which is to suggest you're looking at these statutes and saying, you're working the opposite direction of the Trump administration. Let me rephrase. The Trump administration is operating from, we've got to have tariffs. Now let's work backwards and find any threads that will allow these tariffs to continue to occur. I think the way you're looking at this statute is you're looking at them and going, okay, what would allow the president to take tariffs? And presumably, if we were using your model all the way, you might come to the realization, okay, I don't have a tool in my tool chest. I don't think that's coming from the Trump administration. So I hear what you're saying, but my guess here, I say guess as if it's just my scholarly hypothesis here is to suggest I think I think the White House is going to continue to finagle the conditions into such a way that you have it. And he's going to play the same Trump game that we saw even before he was the president, which was take me to court. And then just like with this, it takes about a year. It gives him another year of having tariffs. And that's why the markets are discounting these. If they thought the Trump administration was operating under the premise you were, my guess is that they'd be somewhere closer to like 80 cents on the dollar because you would be taking in just the hedge for recovering it. This is also the hedge on we don't think it's ever going to happen.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Just to be clear what I'm talking about, that Section 122 authority only applies to address serious, what are called balance of payment deficits. Now, the thing is that it's almost literally impossible to actually have a balance of payments deficits in the post-Bretton Woods era when we have a floating currency. This was done back just shortly after the system changed and no one really knew what the hell was going on exactly. But basically under the old system, countries fixed their currency values kind of at a specific exchange rate relative to the US dollar, and you could convert that to gold at a rate of like $35 per ounce or something at the time, I forget. But the point is that while we do have a trade deficit, we do not have a balance of payment deficit. No one really thinks we do. And in fact, even Trump's Justice Department doesn't think we do. When the IEEPA tariffs were being litigated, Justice Department attorneys wrote in a brief that Section 122 doesn't have, in their words, any obvious application here where the concerns the president identified in declaring an emergency arise from trade deficits, which are conceptually distinct from balance of payments deficits. So, I mean, this is clear. But your point, even if there are legal challenges, there's no way there's going to be a final ruling before that 150-day window. Though I'm betting that some lawsuits may be filed shortly. As of our airtime, I didn't find any. And of course, the Court of International Trade could always enjoin those tariffs pending a ruling on the merits. But I think your point is exactly right, is they're going to just use whatever lever they can. I mean, we saw that with Biden and student loan forgiveness on a much smaller economic scale, but it was the same sort of thing. We want to do this, and we'll figure out some legal or semi-legal authority, and let's throw this up against the wall, see if it sticks.
Yeah, it's the working backwards policy of making things legal, right? Yeah. So instead of saying, what are the things that I can do based on the structures that are available to me, the answer is, here's what I'm going to do. Now, how do I jerry-rig the system in? Yeah. And I think your Biden example is spot on. There was no universe in which, I mean, did it look a little bit different? Was it quite this blatant? Maybe not. But it's the same basic pattern of behavior, which is to say, we're going to forgive some student loans. How do we make that happen? And right here, we're going to have some tariffs. How do we make that happen? Yeah. And whether you take a more expansive view of the unitary executive presidency, you or a less me, nobody from the Trump administration is sweating over the fact that there's an Article 1 or what the vesting clause's edge is. Let's be honest.
Yeah. And they know that they're not going to win a congressional vote on extending those tariffs. They're just, the votes simply aren't going to be there. And that also is going to put a number of Republicans potentially in an awkward position. This would happen the end of July, election less than 3 months away. And so that's not all that great. But I think what's going to happen is they're going to really try to rush the process of imposing more permanent tariffs under Section 301, that's unfair trade practices, and 232, national security. But with both of those are required by law to have pretty involved investigations, and then findings have to be published. There's public comment periods involved in some of these things. It's a long and involved process. Typically, we're talking for Section 301, a year or more from start to finish. For 232, maybe around 9 months. Now, I am sure the Trump administration is just going to push this through as quickly as possible. It's going to be kind of a quick scattershot thing, but still it's going to be tough to get that done in 5 months. And I'm sure those will be challenged as well. And Then, of course, there's that whole issue, Trey, we haven't talked about even of tariff refunds. Right now, I think more than 1,000 companies have filed suit attempting to recoup those costs. But the fact of the matter is even if they recouped all those costs, those costs come back to the companies. But what about the individuals who ended up paying more for goods? Well, you and I, who had to pay more for stuff because of tariffs, it's not like that money's just gone.
Yeah, no company's going to be like, hey, by the way, we just won this lawsuit. Here's $50 back or whatever. No. And that is part of the problem that we're seeing right now. I know that it might seem a little weird, like, why are these kinds of things a big deal? Why do you take such a long time to implement tariffs? But the answer is underlying economic systems take a minute to absorb and to figure out what's happening on these fronts. And to have all of these shifts leads to the companies don't want uncertainty. And that's actually one of the problems about companies and democracy, right? Because they can end up wanting the more stability of non-democracy, even though like the other items. But this is the antithesis kind of problem. You can wind up in these kinds of circumstances. Yeah. But again, of those 1,000 companies looking at that right now, it looks like right now, somewhere in the vicinity of 70% of them have already sold the rights that they could have gotten back, which is also fascinating. Yeah. Which means, it could be the case that we do see the one thing that we might see as a result of this is we might actually see a relatively large number of cases coming up, because it wouldn't be coming anymore from the companies in question, which would be expensive, but it might be collectively under the hedge funds who own the actual rights to collect the debt after having purchased it from those companies. But that's going to take a second to see how that all plays out.
And there'd be questions potentially of standing and other things that could complicate that. But I think one smart political move that some congressional Democrats have made is introducing legislation to
send it to people
that would force the administration to issue tariff refunds without firms having to sue. And the argument here that they're making is that, maybe that's fine for these big companies who have these big litigation departments and have a lot of excess. But what about the small companies, the mom and pop, the independent businesses? Are we just going to screw them over and make them sue? They don't have the resources for that. So I think for a Democratic Party that oftentimes has been really not very good at kind of getting that we're for the little guy sort of vibe, that to me is a smart move, because if you're going to ask a Republican member of Congress, why didn't you vote for this legislation that would help small and medium-sized businesses? MAGA? I don't know. What would you say? I don't think it's going to go anywhere. I don't even know if it would get to the floor, but I like the idea of that. And I think it's good as just a matter of public policy.
Yeah, I don't think it gets to the floor, though, because you're talking about the House, and there's no way that Mike Johnson makes that easy to come out of committee. So we'd have to see it coming from a senator first before that could come forward, where you automatically have a chance to bring things to the floor in a way that you don't over in the House. So could that come up? Maybe, but that would be the kind of pressure. If I was a Democratic strategist, I'd be doing it from the Senate side to try to put pressure on the House side to create a midterm voting issue, because that's the ad right there. And I don't disagree with you. But the question is going to be, do they decide to pursue that or not? And in the past, it seems like Democrats have not pursued those kinds of policies. And I don't know why. It's a good question that I don't probably have a great answer to.
And, I think now, if I'm a U.S. trade partner, I'm thoroughly confused at this point. There's no stability. It's not clear what my tariff rate's going to be from 1 month to the next. And even if I'm a U.S. company that has any kind of international supply chain, I'm like, how am I supposed to plan exactly? And I think the best strategy might be just to kind of lay low and wait for all this to kind of play out, which sounds like a recipe for slowing economic growth. It's just such a mess right now.
And you're leaving out the huge issue here of we are in one of the biggest industries in which we have these kinds of complicated source processes. We're talking about DRAM, the processing for computers. As a result of AI, whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, it is creating huge supply chain issues. It's already being felt across industries. There's a variety of items that you can't purchase. Like, take a look over at the software and hardware applications. They can't come out. The Nintendo Switch 2, had price increases. It looks like they have more price increases. I know that seems dumb, but it's not a bad place to be looking at for the cost of these DRAMs and RAM. And so that's already happening. And so this, combined with that, could create for all the talk about, hey, we got to be forward thinking about AI, the tariff instability is probably going to be the largest AI unfortunate disruptor that we've ever seen, not to mention the downstream effects on consumers, as this particular item is going to be more supply side constrained. I can speak.
When I think about the politics of this, I mean, right now, clearly, it seems clearly to me that the tariff regime is unpopular. Navigator Research did a poll after the Supreme Court's opinion, found that 70% of Americans believe that Trump's tariff policy is driving up costs, and that includes 63% of non-MAGA Republicans and 39% of MAGA Republicans. So that's a pretty big deal. But then I think, how much staying power does that sort of thing have? Because as you know, the issue attention cycle can be pretty short, and I think that I don't know if this necessarily has a lot of power, say, in November necessarily. Of course, a lot will depend on what things look like there, but we'll have to see about that.
Well, that's why I point back to RAM and DRAM. I think that's one of the areas where it really could have, and it's not just the esoteric areas of things like your computer chips, but if you don't have cars need those same low-level computer chips, but the car supply for DRAM is actually one of the least expensive. And so companies are shifting it over to power things like AI. So I hear that, but I think the area where this could be the most impactful are all of the items that need those RAM chips that are going to be hit from two different sides at once. And that's why I bring that up, Mike. You're not wrong to suggest, hey, which of these are going to continue to be an issue? This is the one where I'm not saying it's definitive, but this is where, if you want to say put some money on it, this is where I'd put the money, is where you could have a long-standing still a problem in November. And if you can't purchase things, or if there's a shortage of things, that's an issue.
Just a quick message, when my gut is off, well, everything feels a little bit off. My digestion, energy, mood, even my focus. And every day your gut's fighting a silent war against processed food, stress, toxins in the air. And when your gut struggles, your whole body feels it. And most probiotics, well, they never make it to your gut alive, so they don't work. But Just Thrive, clinically proven to arrive 100% alive and deliver measurable results. And Just Thrive turns your gut into an antioxidant factory. It creates protective compounds exactly where you need them most. And that means benefits, better digestion, healthy immunity, more energy, easier weight management. And Just Thrive probiotics come in capsules or berry-flavored gummies, so there is an option for everyone in the family. And for over a decade now, Just Thrive has been helping thousands of people take control of their health with science-backed solutions you can trust. From their award-winning probiotic to their full line of gut, immune, and brain health supplements, Just Thrive is ready to help you live your healthiest life. And you can try Just Thrive probiotics for 90 days risk-free, and you can save 20% on your first order with code CX. See the difference for yourself or get a full product refund, no questions asked. Take the 90-day Just Thrive Probiotic Challenge today at justthrivehealth.com/CX. Be the best you with Just Thrive. Okay, Trey. So, let's get into AI a little bit more. So, okay. The Pentagon, we're recording this Friday afternoon. A few hours from now will be the deadline that the Pentagon gave an LLM company Anthropic to drop its AI safety guardrails for DoD use. Now, Defense Secretary Hegseth, he basically summoned Anthropic CEO Dario Amati to the Pentagon on Tuesday, the 25th, demanding that Anthropic give the military unrestricted use of Claude, it's Anthropic's AI model, or face blacklisting, contract cancellation, and potentially be forced to comply anyway under the Defense Production Act. And the heart of the dispute really involves two restrictions Anthropic has refused to drop to this point. It won't allow Claude to be used for mass domestic surveillance of Americans, and two, it won't allow it in fully autonomous weapon systems that can kill without a human being in the loop. Now, the Pentagon says it just wants freedom to use the AI for all lawful purposes and that it follows the law. Anthropic has replied that the law hasn't caught up to the technology and that AI isn't reliable enough for lethal autonomous decisions yet. And this isn't just theoretical. Claude was reportedly used in that January raid that captured Maduro, and when an Anthropic employee raised questions about that use, that sort of set off a chain reaction that brought that relationship between Anthropic and DoD to the breaking point it's at now. Now, the Pentagon reportedly has already contacted, I can speak too, Trey, Boeing and Lockheed Martin about their exposure to Anthropic, sort of laying the groundwork for that supply chain risk designation, which, by the way, previously has only applied to foreign adversary companies like Huawei and Kaspersky. Now, Elon Musk's XAI has signed an all legal uses deal with the Pentagon this week with no additional restrictions, and it looks like the other AI giants, Google and Gemini and OpenAI with GPT, are in the process of doing something similar, meaning that Anthropic's early lead in DoD integration, well, that's under real threat at this point. So, Trey, what do you think? Is Anthropic sort of rightly sticking to their guns, or is DoD right to be pushing them for unfettered all legal uses access?
This might be the time when I've prepped for a show where I couldn't help but feeling I was living in a dystopian, the beginnings of a prelude to a dystopian novel.
Okay.
I'm not going to lie.
Going.
Well, so I appreciate what Anthropic is doing. I do. And I recognize that there can be valid criticisms of suggesting that you're going to have safeguards in a contract with the United States government. I get that. However, it does not fit to me when we take a look at Hegseth's claim that we're only going to use it for all legal purposes. If that was, in fact, the only desire, we would not be having an issue right here. Because let's be clear, you can't have mass surveillance using AI legally exactly as it's, from the DOJ at least, the way that we're looking at. So my question then becomes to say, okay, what is it that you want to do that is legal? We'll put quotation marks around that for those of you listening, of course, that you can't do with these two very minor, very flimsy safeguards, right?
I think a couple of things, actually. For instance, and there was a memo or post that the Anthropic CEO put out there. My name came up blanked on my head for a second. He said, for example, under current law, okay, well, you're right, mass surveillance, domestic surveillance of Americans is not okay under current law. But what you can do, he pointed out, is that, well, the government, there's nothing that restricts the U.S. government from purchasing detailed records of Americans' movements, their web browser, all kinds of other information, and use AI to pull all that together to basically paint a comprehensive picture of any person's life and do it automatically and do it for tens, hundreds of millions of people.
Yeah.
As far as I know, there's nothing, maybe I'm wrong here. I don't know that there's any statute that says that makes autonomous weapon systems.
I looked at
illegal.
that. There is not. There is nothing that suggests that a person has to be the decision maker for a trigger pull.
And so I think that Anthropic is making a couple of very good points. And of course, as folks who kind of follow LLMs know, that Anthropic was sort of formed from people who broke off of OpenAI, and they've always been they said they've been the most sort of security conscious and worried about AI risk. Now, they've changed their policy a little bit here in this last week, because at first they said, we're going to stop development on frontier models if we feel like the capability of these models is greater than our ability to control them. And now they're kind of backing off of that because they realize that no one else is doing that, and that puts them at a real competitive disadvantage. And I think that's a reasonable position to take.
No, I agree. And I think this also is a great time. This is a moment, I think, more than ever before, where we as a population need to take seriously the disconnect between technology and law. It has grown significantly over the years, from things like unlocking a phone with a face to not, in other words, biometrics data and how that applies under the law and doesn't. We haven't really updated for that, which leads to these weird circumstances. We have a variety of questions as it relates to privacy because we've been really reluctant to get into that kind of conversation technologically. What can other companies hold about people? But now, as we see, we've talked about it personally even, the power of large language models, put aside whether it's thinking or not thinking, like let's not go too far down the dystopian novel route. The amounts of its ability to pull together information in this way should give any citizen pause about the kinds of guardrails that we want to have, and not just with the DOJ, but I think across the board. And the position of Hegseth is deeply concerning to me, which is to suggest that there ought to be no limits on it. And so this is where we need Congress. We need Congress to come in together. We need Congress to be bipartisan. Here's a particular, I think, an easy bipartisan potential issue to say, what are going to be the edges of these use cases? We need those. For example, I think it would be phenomenal to have a rule that says you can't kill people unless a human being is a part of that decision-making process. And not just for the decision-making process, but so that we can have people who are accountable for what is happening. Because you don't want to live in a world where somebody goes, I don't know what to tell you. It was the AI.
But I'm really sympathetic to that view. That's the view I want to go with. But then I think I always put this in context of a competition with China. And so I think, well, okay, let's say that we pass military AI restrictions or national defense AI restrictions that say it cannot be developed or used in autonomous weapons. Well, I'm pretty sure that China is not going to have those same restrictions. And if all of a sudden they manage to create AI autonomous weapons that are, say, 500% more efficient than anything we have, and they decide, you know what, let's try this out on Taiwan, and we don't have anything to counter that. That's the problem I keep on running into. And this is why, in the end, I'm sort of very reluctantly in agreement with the Trump administration's approach to AI, because if we're putting up regulatory barriers that China isn't, we risk falling behind in a technology that is just stunningly important. And I'm really concerned about that.
And I'm not going to disagree, but I want to maybe waylay a part of your concern there, because I've thought about that too. There is a difference between having a law that says, look, for example, we're not going to allow government agents to use this kind of tool, right? And that is different than saying that we wouldn't have AIs that could do that. Those are actually separate questions. So here's what I'm suggesting for you. I don't think we have to be at a competitive disadvantage via AI because we're not regulated. Notice I didn't suggest that we have to regulate the company and say, look, it can't deal with these kinds of thought processes or it can't deal with these kinds. What I suggested, we should have guardrails on what governments can do with it. The upside to that model then is that it can potentially help with what you're talking about, which is to say, if we thought there was a reason to take the guardrail off, okay, we could do that, as opposed to just having the guardrail off by default. This is different than, again, so for example, the ability of a large language model to produce legal writing already exists, and it will continue to exist. We don't allow those in the legal place. You can't file those kinds of briefs currently. But if we change that ruling, you could do that tomorrow. It's not as if the technology isn't there. Why wouldn't the same thing hold true here? In other words, for you, we're not restricting the technology. We're just saying you can't do it.
Yeah, I see your point.
What would you say to that?
I think on privacy, I would agree, because you can have the ability and not utilize it, and you can test the ability in certain ways and not utilize it at scale. So I agree with the no mass domestic surveillance of Americans. When it comes to war fighting, that's when I think we maybe part ways, because I think it's one thing to have the capability theoretically, but to actually integrate it into weapon systems and to test those weapon systems and to make sure that those weapon systems are effective in the fog of war and under combat situations, that's a whole different thing. That actually does require a lot of extensive testing and integration. And that's why I think that DoD is right to insist that anyone they work with on LLMs give them full legal use access. Now, that being said, I want to be clear, though, I also think that it's not okay for DoD to be strong-arming Anthropic, which is what they're doing because it's already so deeply integrated into so many of them systems. I mean, the idea that they would label Anthropic a supply chain risk. That's almost nonsensical, because supply chain risk typically are firms that either control like a critical input or a critical material and are the only ones. That's not Anthropic, right? Because you got Gemini and GPT.
Well, you've got XAI and you got ChatGPT.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, or a company that's subject to foreign leverage, that's not the case, or a company that's not sufficiently transparent how it does things, or vulnerable to disruptions, like brittle in certain ways. That really doesn't make sense. And so, and also the idea that they could both be a supply chain threat, but also so important to the DoD that they would force them to unlock their model and pull the restrictions under the Defense Production Act, which, by the way, also might not exactly be legal given how the DPA is written. I get what they're doing. They're just putting maximum pressure on Anthropic. But I remember a time when Republicans believed in letting the market do what the market did and weren't always about this. Jay used to have this saying that Democrats kept on saying to companies, hey, nice company there. Be a shame if something happened to it. Well, Trump's gone one further on that, say, hey, nice company here. Now I'm going to destroy part of it, and everyone else, take a look at what I'm doing,
Well, unless you invest properly, in which case we're going to be fine.
We need our taste. We need to wet our beaks, on this one here.
There's a political science term for that somewhere. I hear that. I think we're going to come down slightly differently there. But I can understand the reason. I still would want some safeguards there, and I would still argue that there is even a level of testing that would be possible on the military side without currently killing individuals using the process. I mean, you can test it using it's the same way we test other weapons without actual human beings being the test dummies.
Well, sure, yeah.
For that. And I hear that maybe we're making a pretty slight distinction, but the last thing I kind of say on that kind of front is I hear what you say, and I don't have a phenomenal, hey, I can make it safe. However, what I can say is one of the reasons I want to live in an America and not a China is explicitly because I don't want to trade all of my safety for all of my liberty. And does that make me a little bit more vulnerable, or maybe even a moderate amount, to a place like China? It probably does. And I don't think I can disagree with you on that front. But I think where we're going to fall off differently is that I don't want to lose that in the pursuit of the safety. And so, but I hear your point.
I get that. Yeah, I get that. And I guess where I'm particularly concerned in the near term is that, okay, China right now still clearly behind the U.S. and when it comes to AI, and there really isn't anyone else who's even close to China in the U.S. We're the only two serious players here. But I mean, the U.S. is still way ahead, especially in terms of the compute to train those frontier models. But China is working awfully hard on that. And, I think, regulatory drag could help them erase some of that current U.S. advantage. And, by the way, if China decides, hey, next year is the year to kind of bring Taiwan under our thumb, whether it's direct military action or some kind of massive blockade or something like that, I think a lot of people don't realize what a big deal that could be. The TSMC, the semiconductor factory in Taiwan, something like over 90% of all advanced frontier chips come out of TSMC. And so if something happens, we're trying to diversify that, but it's going to take some time. And the idea that the source for almost all of our chips for advanced AI comes right next door to China from some very vulnerable country that China has clearly indicated it still thinks is part of China, that more than gives me pause. It freaks me out a little bit.
No, and again, I will have to say 100% fair on that argument. And one of the problems on the diversification, because for listeners, why do we do it that way? It's not some weird. The answer is that the individuals who have the scale or have the skill to scale up those kinds of productions have simply come from there, right? As a matter of fact, Tim Cook of Apple was recently asked, well, why is there so much there? And he said, well, it's not because we all picked it. I wasn't curious about. He said, but go take a look at the kind of people who are coming out of their educational system combined with the already existing infrastructure that they have. and you find me somebody else who will be able to do what they do, not just in the next 5 years, but call the next 15 years. And that's the thing that makes that hard. So just to be clear for listeners, I think sometimes when you hear that, you think, oh, what's the cabal? And that wasn't the answer here. It was, this is more of a kind of a Ricardo competitive advantage that Taiwan created for itself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, on that note, Trey, why don't we close out this episode? We still have a ton more to talk about, and we will do that on the supporters exclusive midweek show. All kinds of interesting stuff we'll get to, but that will be for, as everyone knows, that drops on Tuesday morning. So for now, anything either Trey or I talked about, he said, oh my God, what were they thinking? Well, we want to hear from you, or even to say, good job, Mike or Trey, or what have you. You can do that, mail@politicsguys.com. Also, Facebook or X, we always put links in the show notes. And of course, if you're on our Discord, we hope you are and you're a supporter, well, you can reach us there. Trey and I are on that all the time. Also, if you are a supporter, if you want to become a supporter, you'll get, in addition to Discord access, you will get ad-free versions of all of our content and that full-length midweek episode instead of just that 15-minute preview or so. And so we hope you'll consider that if you have the means and you feel like what we're doing is valuable. If you do, but you don't have the means, well, we can help you out with that. We never want lack of ability to help us out, keep you from getting our content. So if that's your situation, let me know, Mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get you set up with full access to that midweek show. And whether you are a supporter or not, it really does help us if you can just take a minute to subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you use, as well as to share episodes on social media. And as always, before we go, a very special shout out to our wonderful executive producers. They are Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, Jody Marie Miller, and Sean Fugate. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
It's tax season, and at LifeLock, we know you're tired of numbers. But here's a big one you need to hear. Billions. That's the amount of money in refunds the IRS has flagged for possible identity fraud. Now here's another big number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, we'll fix it guaranteed. One last big number. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast for the threats you can't control. Terms apply.